G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 3 of our rendering series in which we create a realistic still life image. And this video is all about the different ways you can go about creating the textures for your fruit. Now, if you watched my previous video on creating the velvet texture for this scene, then creating the textures for the fruit should be a bloody walk in the park. So as a result, this video is going to be fairly brisk in the way that I explain things. And as always, if you sign up to my Patreon today, you will get the source files for this project along with an ad-free version of the video you're watching right now, along with other goodies exclusive to Patreon members. And if you just want to support the channel through a like or a subscription on YouTube, feel free to do that. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so to get started with this video, I want to preface what I'm about to do here by saying that there is no be-all and end-all method for creating any kind of texture or any kind of material inside of the 3D landscape. You can do it in a myriad of ways, whether it's using traditional texturing techniques, procedural techniques, or using third-party apps such as Substance Painter. And we'll touch on that probably in the next video a little bit. But for now, I'm going to show a few various methods that we can go about when it comes to creating these textures. Now, some of these methods require you to UV map your models. Others just require you to use the node editor. So it's really up to you what method you go with for the different kinds of fruit. But let's get started with some basic UV mapping technique. Now, obviously, the traditional way of doing a UV map is to create some seams and then just do an unwrap. So if you're familiar with Blender and familiar with doing 3D stuff, this should be a cakewalk. Now, there are also different ways we can go about UV mapping inside of Blender, and I'd suggest you just experiment and play with the different ways you can do it. The ones that I use throughout this little time lapse are basically, as you can see here, using seams and then unwrapping, but also in order to clean things up a little bit faster, I'm relying on some third-party plugins such as UV Squares, which is also available on the Blender market. It allows you to straighten out your UVs, as long as the geometry is pretty clean, into nice, well-distributed, squares. So that's what I'm doing here. I've done that with the plums here, and then I've gone through and unwrapped the other parts, such as the stems. Now, this is by no means necessary in order to get a good unwrap, but it does definitely save a little bit of time. At the same time, the way in which you unwrap your models really depends on your intention. And what I mean by that, how are you going to project these textures? What do you want to be displayed? And really, how much detail do you want to put into these textures? So, for instance, with this orange, I've just gone with a spherical projection here because, well, the texture is going to be repeated across the entirety of the model. But I am going through and cleaning things up a little bit just because I want to be neat. I mean, it's not exactly required, given that the fruit will be seen so far away from the camera. But if you do want to get up close and personal to the models in your render, you may have to go through and redistribute some of those UVs a little bit to make sure it's nice and consistent. So I'm just doing that as a display here. Again, it's up to you what you're rendering, who's it for, whether you give a shit. It's really down to the context in which you're going to be putting these textures into practice when it comes to rendering. Like I said, it's entirely dependent on the situation at hand. As you can see here now with the avocado, and I don't think I use it for my render, but I'm showing you how to do it anyway, is again, very traditional, straight up cylindrical projection here in this case. So I just did a cylindrical projection, just tweaked the values a little bit in the settings on the bottom there, and then just worked with that. You can see that at the same time, I'm also going through and tweaking things a little bit using the soft select and the smoothing, just to get a better distribution of UVs. Now with the open avocado, I'm actually putting seams together and then just cutting it using a standard UV unwrap. So add your seams where you think it's best needed, and then just do an unwrap. Very simple. Now with the apple, at least with the models that I have, the models are basically just giant cylinders that have been tweaked to look like an apple. There's actual gaps in the geometry. Now, I don't really give a shit about those gaps because, again, I'm not going to see them in the render, so I'm treating it as a giant cylinder and then just going through. I use UV squares in this case, again, to straighten out those UVs, and then I went through and just straightened out the lines a little bit and lined them up. With the pears, again, you'll see that I actually changed that in the future, so I'm skipping that across. With the bottle, again, a cylindrical projection, and then a camera-based selection on the top and bottom of the bottle to remove any overlapping UVs. With the pumpkin, it's basically a giant sphere, so spherical projection. The UVs aren't perfect, but they do the job. And then I separate the stem, and then I cut that traditionally with a seam, and then unwrap that like a regular UV. Same goes for the rest of the pumpkins, basically either UVs with cylindrical or spherical projection, depending on the shape, and then I cut the stem separately with seams. You'll see how me going with this pattern of the UVs for the pumpkins will actually play into the texturing. So I'm actually considering my method in the UVs when it comes to texturing in the future. And you'll see it's a bloody lifesaver. So make sure that the UVs are at least consistent between similar kinds of fruit. With the cheese, I just went through and just selected parts of the cheese and then just pushed create UVs from selection. And then I just merged things together. Pretty messy in this case, but because the geometry is so messy anyway, I thought this was the fastest way of going about it. You can also probably go with a triplanar projection or a cubic projection, as they call it, I think in Blender. No, sorry, automatic projection. That's what they call it. You may have noticed with the grapes, I didn't actually give a shit about the grapes at all. I haven't even unwrapped them. You'll see why in the future. Okay, for the texturing of the apples, you will need, well, Blender, obviously, but you'll also need an image editing software. I'm going with Photoshop in this case. So what I've done, I've exported out the UV map from Blender as a texture or as an image, a PNG for instance, and I'm using that as a basis for creating the texture around those UVs. Now, I took some photos of some fruit I had at home. I brought them into Photoshop, and now all I'm going to do is line up those fruit onto my layout, my UV layout inside of Photoshop, and then I'm going to clone together the different photos to create a blended photo of a blended texture of basically an apple skin. So I'm going through and making sure that the color grading is the same across each photo, and then I'm just choosing the parts that are in focus, and then I'm going to clone those together using Photoshop's pretty brilliant AI-driven stitching tools. So for instance, content aware fill is probably the reason why I'm using Photoshop for this particular task, is because it makes light work out of, well, a complicated method. The rest of the apple itself, I'm just going to use the clone tool to get rid of some of the highlights in that apple texture, and then I'm going through and just blending things together a little bit cleaner, whatever, to create, well, the apple texture. For the stem, I just found one online, and I'm just cloning that across the UV for that, and then I'm just sort of blending it together to get sort of a semi-detailed version of that stem. Again, it depends on how close up you're going to be into the image. Now, for the material, we only need a diffuse color, because what we're going to do is convert the color map into a black and white map to create, well, firstly, a roughness map. So using a ramp, we hook that into the roughness, and now we have variations in the roughness of the apple. And then we create another ramp to create a bump map. And you'll see that happen in a few moments. But yeah, with a few tweaks of just a black and white map, converted from the color map from the Photoshop file, we've got our roughness map. Now we're going to do the same thing for the bump map. So I'll hook that into the height. And now we have a really strong bump map. We bring that down in detail a little bit, like a really small percentage, to get a little bit of detail in the bump of the apple. Now here's the real brilliance of Blender. This is where Blender really shines as a iterative software. You can't do this in any other 3D software that I know of unless you have a plugin of some sort. Now, and that is being able to actually edit the texture inside of Blender. So what I'm going to do to get rid of that seam, I'm using the clone tool inside the texture editing component of Blender. You hook up the 3D cursor to wherever you want to clone, shift right click, and then just paint away. And you can, because Blender lets you paint between seams seamlessly, you can actually clone away the seam and get a perfect texture for the apple. And the cool thing about this method is because you're only editing one image, i.e. the color image for this texture, and then using the node editor to convert it to black and white, you're effectively editing 3 maps at the same time, or 3 inputs at the same time, which is your roughness, your bump, and your color. And now you have a seamless bump, a seamless color, and a seamless roughness across your entire apple. Now, if you want to change the color of the apple, you basically copy the material over to the other apple or a duplicate apple, and then you duplicate that material. Make sure you duplicate the material, and then you add a hue sat node in between the color matte and the color texture. All right, and then just tweak those values to get the color you want. So in this case, I'm going with a green apple, so I'm just sliding the hue toward the green, and then I have a green apple with one texture. So now I have 2 different fruit. I have a green and red apple using one texture, but also having the roughness and the bump of a real apple, again, from a single texture. No need to go to Substance Painter for this. No need for any conversion software. Nothing. Straight up, apple's done. Same thing with the pumpkin. I had a pumpkin in my kitchen. I took a bunch of photos of the pumpkin, and then I'm just going to follow the same method inside of Photoshop. Just bring in that UV map, line up the pumpkin photos with that UV map, stretch them around, and then clone them together. And then you got yourself a pumpkin texture. I will note, however, you got to be a little bit more considerate about the texture of the pumpkin in this case, because you have those sort of highlights and lowlights around the curvature of the pumpkin. You kind of want to make them straighter inside of Photoshop. You want to straighten those out a little bit, only because that when you bring them into Blender and apply the texture as a material, those lines will stay vertical along the pumpkin. I also go through and actually darken out those lines a little bit, because you kind of lose that detail when you start to use it as a texture for some reason. So you may have to go in and actually actively edit the photo contrast a little bit for that texture. Now for the stem, I just looked up a more higher res version of a nice stem for the pumpkin, and I'm just cloning it across the UV. I am straightening it out a little bit or warping it a little bit, but I then just clone it and then I clean it up a little bit. So it's pretty straightforward when it comes to these sort of things. It doesn't have to be as complicated as you think. It can be a single texture, and because of your understanding of the node editor and how it works and how cycles or Eevee works, you can go ahead and just fix things up on the fly in the node editor. As you can see, I'm doing the same cloney trick there. The UVs are pretty shit for this pumpkin, but with that little bit of edit inside the image editor and the texture editing of Blender, we got ourselves a fairly seamless pumpkin texture. Doing the same thing with the roughness. So I'm trying to get some rougher, like smoother parts when it comes to reflectivity. So the pumpkin I had in the kitchen, the lighter areas were less shiny than the darker areas of the pumpkin. I'm trying to replicate that. So just by tweaking those ramps will get you that result that you need. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve with your particular model. Same thing with the bump, doing the same thing, just making it as subtle as possible, trying to not make it too bumpy because the pumpkin is fairly smooth in real life, but just enough detail to make it feel a little bit more tangible, a little bit more solid, I guess you can say. That's what I'm doing here with the bump. Now with the displacement, you got to make sure that you have to set 2 things on inside the shader when you want to have actual displacement inside the renderer. You need to make sure that you have bump and displacement enabled in the material itself. And you need to make sure that your normals, if you're going to be using a normal map, that it's set to object space. Now what I'm doing here is also trying to enhance the contrast of the texture by using the geometry shape itself to enhance the peaks and troughs of the detail. So I want to get darker lines on that pumpkin. I'm using pointedness in the geometry node to sort of add that contrast, and then I blend that with the color of the pumpkin to get darker blue lines around the little dents of that pumpkin and make it more tangible, more obvious. And again, playing with these different things inside the node editor is much easier than you may think. So I definitely recommend you just play with those nodes. Pointedness is basically curvature in Blender. So if you're familiar with other software, that's what that is. And I'm also blending that with the bump map and the displacement map to get darker or deeper troughs, deeper dips in that pumpkin shape, so I can really make that geometry stand out. So yeah, a combination of the bump and the curvature and the displacement node, you can get some really strong contrast out of that shape. Again, just tweaking those colors, making sure they look nice and natural, and getting that contrast in, basically. Now, here's the magic part. If you got one pumpkin done, you basically have the other pumpkins done. So say you want to turn this pumpkin, a whole different kind of pumpkin, into a different color, but using the same texture. We can do the same thing we did with the apple by using a hue sat node inside the pumpkin. I've rearranged the UVs a little bit to fill in the texture onto that pumpkin. And now with the color, all I'm really going to do now is tweak the roughness maybe to make it feel a little bit different to the other one. Tweaking the pointedness so different details show up because it's a different kind of model. And then I'm going to add a hue sat, change the hue to be more orange in this case. And then we have ourselves a whole new different pumpkin. And it looks completely different. It's the same texture, but because the contrast is so different, the colors are so different, it wouldn't be perceived to be the same thing. That's the magic here of using the nodes. And for the tip of the pumpkin, I've just replaced the selection with the original texture as well, so that doesn't get affected by the contrast. Now, it's worth noting these methods work within Blender, but they can also work in other software such as Maya and V-Ray and Redshift or whatever. It just depends on what nodes they have that you can play with. So look into the documentation and see what you can do to really create some unique stuff. Now, all right, moving on to the orange. Orange is pretty simple. I actually have a tiled texture, just a tiled texture of an orange. I used a substance sampler to create that, or as it used to be called, Substance Alchemist. But you can find a repeated texture of an orange anywhere, really, or you can just make your own in Photoshop. It's easy. Once you've done that, you basically do the same method as you did with the apple. So you bring the textures in, hook up your color, and you can convert that to black and white, turn it into a roughness node, or turn it into a bump mode, or even a displacement. It's really up to you. That's kind of what I've done here. I think I basically just took the color node in the end and just converted it to get certain kinds of contrast to look more accurate to an orange. The photo I took wasn't great, so I had to sort of play with the contrast to get what I wanted. But you can find those textures online and then just convert them as you need to. It's pretty straightforward with the orange. And by the way, this is where using the asset library is super fucking useful, in that, like, if you have made all those edits in your asset library, they automatically transfer or get inherited by your scene file. So make sure you're doing this in your asset library first before you start editing things in your scene file, because it can be reused. You can reuse these assets in different scenes. So if you have to move them around or put them into another setting, you have that library ready to go. Now, with the plums, this is a completely different method to everything else you've seen so far. This is completely procedural, no textures from Photoshop or outside anywhere. So what I've gone with is a standard shader, made it purple. Now I'm using a generated projection here, which is basically the same as treating these things as boxes. And then what I'm doing next is trying to create a variation in roughness. So similar to a real plum, you know, when you buy a plum and some parts feel or look a little bit more fuzzy than others, I'm trying to replicate that by using a noise node and a ramp to create variations in roughness. So it feels like some parts have been touched or rubbed off, like that little fuzz has been rubbed off, and others are smooth. And it gives it that real natural feeling of, well, a fruit that has just been picked off the shelf. Now I'm doing the same thing here, but with color. So just like in real life, the plums, or plums in general, aren't uniform in their color. They have different shades of reds and purples. And I'm using a node and a ramp to change the way that the colors are, varied. And just making sure that the contrast isn't too strong, but strong enough that it can be noticed and feel natural. That's the point here. Now you can actually manipulate the ramp itself to have colors, or you can use the ramp as a factor in a mix node. So you can actually use a mix RGB node to choose the factor of variation. And ultimately, that's what I end up doing here. I actually convert the ramp back to black and white. And I use those black and white values as mix factors. So you can see here, making that ramp black and white again. And then I have the red and purple as the mix RGB, and then hooking in the black and white ramp into the factor. And then for that blue mix you see at the bottom there, that's for the fuzz. So I'm actually mixing in the roughness now with the fuzz to get sort of that light variation in contrast. So that fuzziness also comes with change in roughness. So I'm using a math node to just ramp that down a little bit, make it more subtle, and then changing the way that ramp is with an alternate ramp. So I don't want the noise to be the same. I'm trying to make it feel natural. So just playing with those different nodes and the ramps and the way they balance each other out, you get a really natural looking plum. And there we have it. As a side note, just to make sure you guys see it, I've also added a little bit of sheen to those plums, just to give it a little bit of that weird fabric-y feel. It seems to work and looks good. Okay, I just want to point out that with the grapes, I don't actually show how to do it in this video, but the method for doing the grapes is essentially exactly the same as the plums. The only difference is that I've added a little bit of subsurface scattering onto the node itself. So on the principled shader, I ramped up the subsurface scattering just a tad, so you can get some light shining through those grapes to make it feel like they're full of liquid, basically. Now, the banana, really straightforward in a way. Again, no textures here, it's just fully procedural. Very similar method to the plum. I'm basically got a pointedness for the edges of the banana to have a bit of a color variation. And then I'm trying to add some brown dots by using a noise modifier, changing the scale of that noise modifier in the, or node, sorry, in the graph editor. And then mixing that with a mix node, and using that ramp as a factor. And now we have spotty bananas. Pretty straightforward there. Again, it just takes a bit of understanding on how the mix nodes work. So really you're working, again, as I mentioned in the previous video, you're working with factors of 0 and 1, and the numbers in between those factors are basically gray values. And how you choose to manipulate those gray values or black and white values is how you determine the mix rate of different nodes. When you're mixing color or mixing materials, that's how you get these variations. Now for the tips of the banana, I'm just going with another material, and I could actually add a displacement to that to make it look more natural, but because it's hidden away in my render, I don't give a shit. I'm not going to bother. Again, it's down to priorities here. If you're not going to see it in the camera, there's no point in actually doing anything about it. Now, I'm also adding further color variation in here by mixing some green into banana to make it feel a bit more fresher. I think I go in the opposite direction in the end. In this case, I actually use a separate XYZ to determine where that ramping of the green will start and end. So check out the separate XYZ node for Blender. Now for the pear, I got ultra lazy. It's basically project by camera angle, and then I just got a picture of a pear, and then I just lined up the UV with the pear. There's a little bit of stretching in parts, but it's so minimal that I don't give a shit. And depending on how the camera is angled and how that pear's angled inside of the render, then it doesn't matter. You won't notice. So again, really lazy, but it does the job. And ultimately what I did here was exactly the same as the apple. Converted that RGB texture into a black and white texture, made some bump, made some roughness, and there we go. And you can see here we have some really effective fruit textures just with these really simple, straightforward methods. Whole different kinds of methods for different things. And for simple stuff such as fruit and like basic things like that, you don't really need fancy pants software like Substance Painter to do the heavy lifting. That will come though when I start talking about more detailed things like the wine bottle and the, table and all that sort of shit. We need to have that sort of detail. Now, I want to end this video by saying, well, firstly, thank you for watching. But for those who are actually trying to do this stuff for the first time, don't get too frustrated if what you're watching is a little bit overwhelming. That's okay. What I would say is take a moment to just see how these nodes operate and what you can do with them. This is why I'm going over these things fairly briefly, because ultimately, if I gave you the step-by-step, blow-by-blow breakdown of everything in this video, firstly, it would take like 5 hours. But also, I would wager that you would actually not gain all that much more from those videos directly. And not enough that where if you try to make your own specific textures and materials for your own things, I don't think a 5-hour video is going to help you much more than a 25-minute video in this case. What matters here is that you learn to understand that the node editor is flexible, that building materials can be done in more than one way, and that as long as you understand those fundamentals of PBR materials, metal, roughness, subsurface scattering, bump maps, normal maps, that sort of shit, and then also combining that with geometry data, whether that's UVs, like knowing how UVs work, or projection, like box projection, or generated projection, object projection. If you learn about those, and you can learn about those very easily just by going to the documentation on the Blender website. So for example, in the documentation, if you want to learn how to use the mix node effectively, just go to the mix node documentation on the Blender website, and it will have all the information you'll need. Everything you'll need in one hit, and you'll know it in about 5-10 minutes. Easy. So yeah, I firmly believe that if you take an active approach in your learning, you will learn far more effectively. With that in mind, I'm going to say thank you for watching yet again. Appreciate everyone who watches these videos. And all I will say is catches and have fun. Also, credit where credit's due. Thank you for all of those who have so far subscribed to my Patreon channel. I really appreciate the support, and I will do my very best to make sure that I continue to provide the best videos possible for creating 3D art. So again, thank you very much, and I'll catch you later.